Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, in the Commons this week, Jeremy Corbyn warned Theresa May not to rush to judgment over who was behind the Salisbury nerve agent attack. Much of the press, the Conservative Party and a fair chunk of his own backbenchers promptly rushed to jump all over him as a Russian appeaser. But is that fair? After all, he was on the unpopular side of the argument in Parliament when it came to Iraq and Libya, and he feels he was proved right. Shami Chakrabarti, the Shadow Attorney General, is with me now. Thanks very much.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can I start by asking you very clearly, do you think that Vladimir Putin's government was responsible for what happened in Salisbury?
What I think is what Theresa May has said, which is that there's a responsibility of the regime, either in relation to having lost control of this chemical weaponry, or it's even more serious and it's a malevolent directed attack. And that's an important distinction going forward, because you're not going to get cooperation from a state that has deliberately targeted you, but you might get cooperation even from a slightly embarrassed state that has lost control of its stocks of chemical weapons. And I think that's an important distinction, and that's the distinction that Jeremy was making, but it's also a distinction that Theresa May has made herself.
So to be absolutely clear, when Boris Johnson says it's overwhelmingly likely that it was Putin himself and other states have agreed with him, you don't agree with that?
If Mr Johnson is saying that, he must be saying that on the basis of new evidence that, that Mrs May has not yet spoken about.
So at the moment, so far as you're concerned, it is not absolutely clear that this was directed by the Kremlin.
That's my understanding. It's either a loss of control, which, by the way, is pretty serious, including under the International Chemical Weapons Convention, and needs to be sorted out if that's the issue, or it is what the Foreign Secretary is suggesting. But if he is suggesting that, that would be on the basis of new evidence that's not been shared with Jeremy Corbyn, and it's not what Mrs May has said to date. Because
a lot of the world seems to have taken the same view. I mean, France, the United States, Germany have all said that they think it was Putin who was responsible for this.
Have they really, though, said it's Mr Putin directly, individually?
So the Russian state,
yeah, but that's my point. I think, you know, you said to me earlier we need to be forensic about this, and I think we do. The Russian state is responsible for its stocks of chemical weapons, or historic stocks of chemical weapons from there. You're responsible whether you lose control or whether you personally direct extrajudicial killings.
But they're very, very different, of course.
Indeed, but you're responsible in any event, but what kind of culpability and what kind of responsibility is it? That's important.
Absolutely. So if you are not yet sure that it was the Russian state doing this themselves, why were you supporting the expulsion of 23 diplomats?
Because it's a proportionate escalation. It's part of the diplomatic dance, if you like, even if you're trying to get cooperation for a criminal investigation going forwards. But I think that Jeremy was right to support that proportionate escalation, but also to say it will be a tit for tat. There'll be a tit.
Is it?
I think it is, because diplomacy, you know, has an element of protocol and dancing within it. But the crucial thing is to go further now, and that is John McDonnell's suite of economic measures. And also, I think, and I'm here to say, also to pursue the Chemical Weapons Convention, and potentially to ask for inspections, challenge inspections, and, if necessary, further action at the international level.
Let's look at the alternative theory, which is that this material leaked out or was sold during the dissolution of the Soviet Union from some Russian facility and was acquired by some kind of mafia gang or other group of some kind. Have you any evidence that that happened at all?
All that we have is what we've been told, or what my Privy Councillor colleagues, like Jeremy, have been told by the government. And what we have been told is what Mrs May has said. She's outlined the two possibilities. That is the directed attack from the Kremlin or the loss of control. And all we have done...
This appears to be entirely supposition at this stage.
We are just repeating what we have been told, because, of course, we're not in government. But we're just repeating what has been shared with us in security briefings and what Mrs May has said.
We seem to be into a sort of tit-for-tat process now. They've expelled 23 of our diplomats and closed down the British Consulate in St Petersburg, and we are then going to respond to that. How concerned are you about where we are going in this crisis?
I would personally caution against much more tit for tat in that way. I actually agree with Jane Moore, something she said earlier, which is, isn't it important to go, for example, for economic measures that apply not just to Russians, but to apply to dirty money and non-tax paying money, regardless of the nationality of those involved.
Quite a lot of your colleagues are not happy, at least with the tone of what Jeremy Corbyn said. Neil Griffith has said, the defence spokesperson, has said that Russia was definitely responsible.
Yeah,
Sir Keir Starmer has said there should be no ifs nor buts, Russia should be called out.
And I agree with all of that. And by the way, you know, Neil Griffith sent me a good luck text before I came on here, so there is no difference between us. Russia is, I repeat, Russia is looking responsible, whether it's negligent responsibility in not keeping control of these weapons or whether this is an extrajudicial killing and attack. But the distinction between the two types of Russian responsibility is still important going forward.
A lot of Labour MPs who are concerned enough to put down motions and so forth. Your colleague Chris Williamson has called them enemies and said they should be deselected. This sort of culture war inside the Labour Party is bubbling up on this issue. Are you at all concerned that this is the moment when the cracks could start to become unbridgeable?
No, and I am here to make clear that I am completely at one, not just with Jeremy, but with Neil Griffith, Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer. We must condemn Russian responsibility, whether it is negligent or whether it is even more serious. But in order to be safer and in order to take control of these chemical weapons and to eliminate them from the world, you do need to make a distinction between negligence and taking back control and something that could be even more serious, which is directed attacks against people on our territory.
Quite a lot of your colleagues look at Jeremy Corbyn's office and they see Seamus Milne and what he has said about Russia in the past, and they see Andrew Murray, who has arrived from the Communist Party quite recently, and they just don't feel that he is speaking for them.
Well, I think people shouldn't be directing attacks on staff, as it's kind of not fair to pick on people who can't sort of speak for themselves. Jeremy is the leader of our party, but he also has a very strong team of shadow cabinet colleagues, some of whom you've cited, and we are all at one in the approach that I have just outlined.
So when it comes to people like the father-in-law of the police officer who was poisoned in Salisbury, who said that he found Mr Corbyn was mealy-mouthed and disappointing when it came to Russia. What do you say to, as it were, people outside the bubble who are looking in from the outside and just not quite sure about the tone?
Well, look, I think that the tone is also spun. Whether it's Jeremy Corbyn's tone, which I think has been robust but also appropriately measured, or whether it's the Defence Secretary, who one minute does talk about proportionality but then says shut up and go away. This is a very febrile moment, and I think people's words do get spun by the media and so on. That's understandable. I'm not, you know, going ballistic about that. But obviously people are concerned, people are worried, and that's why there's a responsibility on all of us to try and get our tone right.
Do you trust our intelligence services on this?
I do.
So there's no need, therefore, to send the Russians evidence of the nerve agent used. We can accept their word that it was Novichok.
No. Here's the thing about sending agents beyond this country, either possibly to the Russians if they're asking for it, or to the organisation that prevent. The reason for doing that is because it's the protocol of the convention, and I believe in pursuing these investigations under international law, because that's how you garner the broadest international coalition to get support going forward.
Do you think in the last couple of days there has been a McCarthyite atmosphere in this country?
I don't want to make things worse. I want to make things better. So I'm not going to escalate my language at this point, if you'll forgive me.
OK, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn suggested there was a sort of McCarthyism about, and certainly he has had a lot of abuse hurled at him over this.
He has had a lot of abuse hurled at him for a very long time, and I try to learn from his dignity under fire.
There is reports today of a new group of Labour MPs called Start Again or something, which is a kind of centrist, pro-European group who are very exercised about this issue and about others. Are you at all concerned that we are heading towards a position where the Labour Party might split?
I'm not too concerned. People have always had their democratic prerogative to experiment with new parties, and And there's been talk in the Westminster bubble.
It's
there's
gone
been talk
on
about
and on and on,
for
and it's
some
never
time.
happened. But at some point it might.
Well, you know, there've been in past decades there have been experiments in new parties, but the Labour Party is a very fine and broad coalition, and I actually think it represents the new moderation in British politics, like taking on dirty money, like protecting people's jobs and services. I think that that I'm a moderate and pretty much always have been.
All right, Chami Chakrabarti, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. So far, the Russian response to Theresa May's expulsion of Russian personnel has been relatively cautious and proportional, but it's come alongside quite a lot of brutal mockery of Britain from official Kremlin outlets. Senior Russian spokesmen have by and large kept off the airways, but I was able to catch up with Mr. Putin's ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chichkov, in Brussels this week. Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and other NATO allies have all said that Russia was responsible for the nerve attack in Salisbury. Were you?
Highly likely, they said. Russia, and I can assure you, without using the phraseology like highly likely, which has become very popular these days, Russia had nothing to do with it.
Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, has gone even further, and he said that it is very, very likely that Vladimir Putin himself ordered this attack.
Well, that rests with the responsibility of Boris Johnson, who I believe is acting in an inappropriate manner, which doesn't give him credit.
This was an attack on a man widely regarded in Russia as a traitor, using a chemical agent regarded as being made in Russia. And that is why many people in Britain say it is overwhelmingly likely the Russians must have been responsible. And if not the Russians, who?
Well, this whole case is based on assumptions, based on suspicions fueled by emotions. You rightly referred to Mr. Skripal as a traitor, as a defector, but, you know, I can assure you that he is almost forgotten in Russia. He has been living in Britain for 8 years now. Before that, I think I should stress the point, he was officially pardoned by a presidential decree, which means that whatever one can think of him in the moral sense, but from the legal point of view, the Russian state had nothing against him. And also, I should add, his daughter, Yulia, is a Russian citizen. That's why among the many violations by the British authorities in this case, I will cite that it is a blatant violation of the bilateral consular convention by not allowing Russian diplomats and consular officials access to a Russian citizen currently in hospital.
And the Russian state has now announced criminal investigations into the attempted murder of Yulia Skripal and indeed Mr. Glushkov as well. Can I ask, as part of that investigation, whether Russian authorities will be seeking access to the nerve agent and to the police who are involved in the case?
Certainly, the Russian investigative committee will request cooperation from the British authorities according to international law and existing bilateral agreements. Actually, the Russian side, through the embassy in London, requested access to evidence, if any, if there is any, to the nerve agent from the very beginning, from the first day, but was flatly refused. In spite of that being Britain's obligation on the basis of the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
This is a very obscure nerve agent, not much understood around the world. Has Russia ever produced this agent, Novichok?
No.
Never?
No. Actually, Russia has stopped production of any chemical agents back in 1992. So you cannot even talk about any chemical agents produced by Russia. All that had been produced previously was produced by the Soviet Union. In 1992, the then President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree stopping all production, and according to the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, last year in 2017, Russia destroyed all its stockpiles. There is only one country today which hasn't done so, which is still retaining its chemical stockpiles, and that is the United States of America.
Can I be absolutely clear then? Russia has no stockpiles of any nerve agents whatever?
Indeed, no stockpiles whatsoever.
So then there is the question, how did this agent come to be used in Salisbury? It has been suggested, for instance, that during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, some of this agent may have been stolen or sold and ended up in the hands of either criminal gangs or other state parties. What's your view?
Well, why don't you ask yourself the question, how come the British authorities so quickly managed to designate the nerve agent used as something called Novichok? It can only mean that they had a standard...
It has a signature, I think. It has a chemical signature that they were able to...
But when you have a nerve agent or whatever, you check it against certain samples that you retain in your laboratories. And Porton Down, as we now all know, is the largest military facility in the United Kingdom that has been dealing with chemical weapons research. And it's actually only 8 miles from Salisbury.
You're not suggesting that Porton Down is responsible for this nerve agent?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of anything having been used. And of course, I should add perhaps that I exclude the possibility of any stockpiles of any chemical weapons fleeing Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You don't think
there were certain specialists, including scientists who today claim to have been responsible for creating some nerve agent that have been whisked out of Russia and are currently residing in the United Kingdom.
So they defected. They said it was made and that it was tested in Uzbekistan, for instance, and that therefore it was around and could have been stolen, could have been sold on.
I will not comment on their words, but they were involved in certain research of various chemical weapons, yes,
okay.
In the Soviet years.
In her response, first response, Theresa May has expelled 23 Russian citizens. Were they spies?
Of course not. They were diplomats.
Are there any Russian spies in Britain?
Come on. You're not asking the right person, perhaps. Are there any British spies in Russia?
One of the other possibilities that Britain has talked about is the use of the so-called Magnitsky Act to freeze the assets of various people who've been using London to wash money through London, individuals. In some respects, I would imagine you would welcome that.
Well, I wouldn't care about the fate of money being laundered in London, be it Russian or of any other origin.
And what about the suggestion that members of the royal family and politicians and so forth won't come to Russia for the World Cup? The World Cup was going to be a very, very big moment for modern Russia.
Indeed.
Is this a blow to Russia?
Well, I'm sure that those members of the royal family who had been planning to come will be sorry hearing that from their own government.
It's been a very difficult time in relations between Russia and Britain. There's been a whole series of issues, alleged Russian involvement in elections in Europe and America and Britain as well, lots of tensions over the Baltic states and Ukraine and so forth. Looking ahead, what do you see for Britain's relationship with Russia after we've left the EU?
Well, you know, at one point I said to a British colleague of mine that I was actually looking into a bright future of Russian-British relations after Brexit, because Britain was no longer be confined by EU sanctions or anything like that. Somehow he didn't support that view.
I mean, at this period, there is almost universal anger about British-Russian relationships in Britain at the moment. Gavin Williamson...
And in Russia too.
And in Russia too. Gavin Williamson, our new Defence Secretary, said recently that Russia is going to be thinking, how can we cause so much pain in Britain, damage its economy, rip its infrastructure apart, cause thousands and thousands of deaths, and create total chaos within the UK. That is the perspective of a senior British minister about your country now.
Well, he also said, if I remember correctly, the wording that Russia should shut up and go away. Let me assure that Russia is not going to shut up and will certainly not go away.
There has been a sort of sense in Britain that Russia was almost mocking us about this terrible attack. Some of your presenters have talked about the British climate being very unhealthy for Russian defectors and people falling out of buildings, and even your president has talked about traitors eating poison and so forth, almost as if people in Moscow regard this as a funny matter.
It certainly is not a funny matter, and actually the latest news that I heard from Moscow referred to the launch of 2 criminal investigations by the Russian Investigative Committee on damage to the health of a Russian citizen, Ms. Yulia Skripal, and the unexplained mysterious death of Mr. Nikolai Glushkov.
And to be absolutely clear, Russian investigators will come to British police shortly and say, we want access to this investigation. We want to work alongside you when it comes to what happened in Salisbury, and we would like to see the nerve agent used, and we would like proper access.
Of course they will, first through correspondence, then perhaps should a personal visit be required, then they will come. And actually, Russia has offered to cooperate on the Salisbury incident from the very outset. But we didn't get any answer whatsoever from the Foreign Office or any other government agency.
Well, listening to that is the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Welcome, Mr. Johnson. We have to be very clear and very careful, of course, about this, the evidence in this very serious matter. So you have said it's overwhelmingly likely that Vladimir Putin was responsible. You saw the ambassador brush that aside. Why do you say that?
Well, we gave the Russians a very clear choice, and the Prime Minister said on Monday, as I said to the Russian ambassador to the UK, you know, either help us to understand how the stockpiles of Novichok have gone missing and how some of it could have turned up on the streets of Wiltshire in this way, or else I'm afraid we will be forced, as the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, to draw the conclusion, as we did in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, that the trail of culpability leads inexorably to the Kremlin. And I think listening to the Russian response, listening again to the response of the Russian ambassador to the EU with his satirical suggestion that this was done by UK agents from Porton Down, this is not the response of a country that really believes itself to be innocent. This is not the response of a country that really wants to engage in getting to the bottom of the matter.
The Prime Minister told the House of Commons there were 2 possible explanations of this. Either this was a deliberate attack by the Russian state, or else the Novichok had come out and become and got into the hands of criminal gangs. You seem to be excluding the latter possibility now.
We gave the Russians every opportunity to come up with an alternative hypothesis such as the one that you have just described, and they haven't. And their response has been a sort of mixture of smug sarcasm and denial, obfuscation and delay. So what we are doing on the Novichok and on the nerve agent, what we will do is tomorrow, technical experts from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons will come from The Hague to the UK. We will share the samples with them. They will then be tested by the most reputable possible international laboratories. And I might just say, in response to Mr. Chizov's point about Russian stockpiles of chemical weapons, we actually have evidence within the last 10 years that Russia has not only been investigating the delivery of nerve agents for the purposes of assassination, but has also been creating and stockpiling Novichok.
So that was a direct lie that I was being given there.
But you will get that, and that is exactly the tactics that we've come to expect from Russia over the last few years. And one of the things that has really struck me in the course of the last few days, as we've been talking to friends and colleagues around the world, is the difference between their reaction this time and their reaction to the death of Alexander Litvinenko. And then back in 2006, there was much more hesitation, much more people saying, well, perhaps it could be rogue elements of the Russian state and so on and so forth. Now you have people such as Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, with her very, very powerful denunciation of Russia. My colleague Jacek Kapuczynski on Friday in London, pointing the finger squarely at Russia. And I think what that indicates is the change in people's attitudes towards Russia because of the experience of the last 10 years.
Is it change in attitudes, their attitude to us? They don't really care anymore what we do or say.
I think that it's obvious that they do care, and I think that is one of the reasons why the UK is, as it were, in the Kremlin's crosshairs, because they look at us and they think this is the country that time and again has called Russia out, has stood up to Russia when it comes to Crimea, to what they've been doing in Syria. And just to get back to the point I was making just now about the international response.
I want to ask you about. Are you absolutely sure it's this mysterious thing called Novichok? We talk about it all the time now. We all assume that it's that. Yeah. How are we sure?
Well, I obviously, to the best of our knowledge, this is a Russian-made nerve agent that falls within the category Novichok, made only by Russia. And just to get back to the point about the international reaction, which is so fascinating. People have all now experienced, whether it's in America, Germany, France, say nothing of the Baltic countries, the Balkans and Poland, they've all experienced Russian meddling, malign, disruptive Russian behavior over the last few years. They can see a country that is going in the wrong direction. And that's why they're so inclined now to not to give Russia the benefit of the doubt and to stand shoulder to shoulder with the UK.
Do you think, given that background, that 2% is enough for our defence spending? An awful lot of your colleagues, including Tobias Ellwood, Defence Minister, it's no longer enough. What's happened to the dollar, but also the threats that we now face from the East, that we do need to protect ourselves better as a country than we have been doing, and we need to spend more money. Well,
we are one of the biggest spenders on defence in NATO, as you know, where we contribute about 20% of European defence spending already, and it's quite right that we should spend well on our defences. And
my question is, should we be spending more than we are targeted to at the moment?
We must make sure that we are adequately and properly defended, and certainly that is a case that I make, and I know
the Chancellor and
other ministers certainly have been making that case. But when it comes to the defences of this country, we are also ensuring that we're protected against cyber attack and attacks on our critical national infrastructure and other such threats.
We read today that there has been increased worry about attacks on the infrastructure, electricity supply, nuclear power stations, water and so forth. Is that something the government is worried about at the moment?
Well, as I say, it's something, obviously, it's a threat that has changed over the last few years, because cyber attacks are a relatively new development, but we have the National Cyber Security Centre. We have fantastic preparations against such threats.
You'll have heard the ambassador talking about Nikolai Glushkov. Do you think the death of Mr. Glushkov is connected to this affair?
That's a matter for the police, and they have to get on with their investigation. I have no evidence of any connection.
Now, the ambassador also said that the Russians are prosecuting the deaths of the daughter, Mr. Kripal, and Mr. Glushkov, because they're both Russian citizens, and that their people will be arriving here and talking to our police, looking for cooperation. Will they get cooperation?
We have wanted cooperation from the Russians in this matter for some days, and we've been greeted with a lot of sarcasm and I think plainly an attitude of a country that is guilty of that. If we can genuinely be of assistance to the Russians in getting to the bottom of what has happened, then we will do that. I rather doubt whether they are entirely serious in what they're doing.
Okay, but if Russian investigators arrive in London and say, we're interested in the attack on Yulia and the death of Mr. Glushkov, we would like to work alongside the British police and have access to the investigation that we're conducting, they will be given that.
We will do everything we can to assist in getting to the bottom of what has happened. Whether it is appropriate to have Russian investigators on UK soil engaged in trying to get to the bottom, I somewhat doubt. But what we will certainly do, as I said earlier,
we will help as far as we can.
What we will do is we will ensure that, and this is I'm afraid the ambassador was completely misleading about the UK's obligations under the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We have followed those obligations to the letter. And what we will be doing now is getting the samples and making sure that they are available to the technical experts to allow them to elucidate exactly what they are. And I think you would agree. I think you would agree that they are a rather more reliable, and I think the British people have much more confidence in what they do than in any Russian investigation.
Let's move on to what happens next. We kicked out 23 of their people we regard as spies. They've kicked out 23 of ours. Tit for tat. Is that?
Well, there is a normal symmetry in these diplomatic affairs, and you would expect that. Look, you've got to understand.
Is it going to go further than that symmetry? Is what I'm asking. Really.
We will discuss at the National Security Council this week what further measures, if any, we may want to take. But I would just stress this, that the UK is already pursuing a number of measures, hardening our borders. Of course, we're pursuing the diplomatic expulsions.
Let me ask you about money.
But we are also going to be using the tools that are available to us under existing statute to pursue those who may have corruptly obtained their wealth. We will be going further with what is called a Magnitsky clause in the sanctions bill, and so all these things are moving forward at the same time. 2 weeks ago, the Labour Party put down Magnitsky Act amendments, and the Conservatives voted against them. Why was that? Well, there were deficiencies in the way those amendments were drafted, which didn't make them suitable. But we are working to get provisions that will allow those who have been responsible for gross violations of human rights to be prosecuted and not to be able to come to this country.
To be absolutely clear, you are going to, as a government, you're going to go after named individuals who have in the past been able to wash their money through London, invest in housing and so forth, and you're going to grab their money.
Well, we live in a democracy under the rule of law. It's not open to me, as a politician in this country, to direct the law enforcement agencies to go after such and such a person. That's what they do in Russia. What we have said, and what we have statute now since April last year under the Criminal Finance Act to do this. We have said that where people have obtained wealth by corruption, and where we can see a link with the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin, it may be possible to have unexplained wealth orders and other sanctions on those individuals. And that work is going on now, and it will be intensifying. But you would not expect me. You would not expect me to reveal the names.
Labour says that part of the Conservative hesitation in this is that you, as a party, have been taking far too much Russian money for far too long. And there's the case of the lady Lyubov Chernukin, who paid £160,000 to have a game of tennis with you. Yeah. Did that game actually take place?
Can I just make a point about this whole anti?
You're going to say good Russians and bad Russians. I know that.
I am actually. I was
going to say back to you that this lady's husband was a minister of Vladimir Putin and was given an award by Vladimir Putin. So he was close to the regime. And you, as a party, were prepared to take £160,000 from her so that she could have a game of tennis with Boris Johnson.
Well, if there is evidence of gross corruption in the way that gentleman you mentioned obtained his wealth, then it is well within the. It is possible for our law enforcement agencies to deprive him of his wealth with an unexplained wealth order. That is a matter for the authorities. It's not a matter for me, and it is very, very important now, because I'm getting a lot of people emailing me from Russia who feel that Russians. No, it's very, very important that we stress.
I agree with that, sir, but
the Russians themselves are in no way the object of our wrath.
I just want to pursue this particular case, if I may.
We have no quarrel with the Russian people.
Did the tennis game actually happen?
It did.
It did. Are you happy that the same lady, and again, do you know enough about the origins of that money? And she has now paid £30,000 to sit next to the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, and have dinner with him. Are you happy about that?
Look, unless and until evidence is produced against individual Russians, I do not think that the entire nation should be calumnified.
It's a difficult balance. I absolutely agree with that.
It is very, very important. There are many Russians who have come to this country and made their lives here and contributed magnificently to our culture and our society. And they feel threatened.
Traduced. I understand that. So, but on the other hand,
it is very important.
Let me remind you what Marina Litvinenko, the widow of Mr. Litvinenko, Sasha, said. She said, Theresa May and the Conservatives need to be very selective who you're friends with. When you allow people with money to come to your country and make a business, you need to be sure what kind of money these people try to bring to your country. Because very often, she said, it had come about inappropriately. All I'm saying is it's very difficult to know exactly the source of the money that you take.
Well, that's why we have the National Crime Agency, that's why we have the National Economic Crime Unit. That's what they are there to do. They are there to get to the bottom of whether somebody's wealth has been obtained corruptly or not. But really and truly, it is very important that we do not allow a miasma of suspicion about all Russians in London, and indeed all rich Russians in London, to be created. Some of them, some of them may have obtained their wealth by corruption. And I have to say, I think it is quite extraordinary at a time when you have two people lying gravely ill in hospital in Salisbury, when a police officer is still is still not out of hospital, for the fire somehow to be turned on Conservative Party funding. As far to the best of my knowledge, all possible checks have been made, and they will continue to be made.
You'll have seen the story this morning about Cambridge Analytica, this data collection company, in trouble for harvesting information from Facebook and then using it to target potential voters. They were involved in the Brexit referendum and the American elections as well.
Yeah,
they've been summoned back to the House of Commons. Do you think there should be a proper investigation into this?
I've got to be honest with you, Andrew, it's not something I've focused on.
Well, let's move to something you have focused on, I'm sure.
But I'm sure if there are, again, I mean, the general point can be made. If there's some crime or then I'm sure that the law must follow its course.
The Brexit Select Committee has suggested that we may have to delay the triggering of Article 50 because we're not ready. What's your response?
Well, I don't think that's true at all, and I think that we're making great progress in the negotiations, and I hope that we'll get a good deal on the implementation period in March. And I think the House of Commons voted overwhelmingly to trigger Article 50, and let's get on with it.
There's another report today, however, saying that our border arrangements simply won't be ready in time. We need more time to do this. Are you concerned that the thing is going to slip?
No, I think we can. I think what most people in this country want, whether they voted leave or to remain, they want us to get on and do with it.
Why did you feel it necessary to write a letter to the Prime Minister saying that there might be a hard Irish border? What I said, I don't wish to. I've got the quote here. We can help you with the quote.
You can. What you have is, I'm afraid, only.
It is wrong to see our task as maintaining no border. Even if a hard border is reintroduced, we would expect 95% of goods to pass. So you use the phrase hard border twice, which is interesting because you are a member of a government which says there's not going to be a hard border.
The whole point about the letter was to say we don't need a hard border, okay? And that's the policy of the government, and that's what we're going to produce. And if you read the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, which was excellent, you will have seen. You will have seen that she produced a number of solutions for the avoidance of a hard border, and that was what I was advocating, and that was if you had the entire document, it would be very clear.
You said you were going to publish the letter. When are you going to do that?
Well, we do not. It is up to the media organisations that leaked a part of it. If they choose to,
you said you would publish it.
Well, it turns out that
you've changed your mind.
We do not, as a matter of course, respond to leaks by putting the whole thing into the public domain. But I can assure you that the letter said the exact opposite of what you have just claimed it said.
Well, I've just read a bit of it. So,
I know.
These are words, and
yes, I know,
words mean things and so forth.
And they don't, as it happens, mean what you want them to mean.
It is wrong to see our task as maintaining no border. The government's only aim should be stop this border becoming significantly harder, even if a hard border is reintroduced, you say, and then you go on.
Well,
let me read it. Publish it.
What I was saying is very clearly in line with what the government as a whole has been saying for a long time, which is there is no need to have a hard border. There are ways of avoiding it, as the Prime Minister said in her excellent Mansion House speech, and I suggest that you quote that and read that and put that.
Okay, I'm going to quote something back at you as well. Do you think that Russia intervened in the Brexit referendum?
I have no evidence for that.
You've said in the past you didn't think they successfully intervened, but you have no evidence that they intervened at all.
Well, I certainly have no evidence that they successfully intervened, no.
Certainly not. OK,
No.
one last Brexit-related question, then we can move on. We haven't spoken for a little while. As, you know, one of the great cheerleaders for Brexit, when you look at what's happening now, when you look at the fact that the European Court will have some influence on us after we leave, when you look at the fact that we're going to be paying money in to be members of some agencies, and you look at the timescale of all of this, are you completely cheerful that it has turned out as you wanted it to do?
I think we've got ourselves into... I do. I think that the Mansion House speech was a great step forward, and I think it shows exactly the type of deal we want to get. We're not going to have the influence of the European Court of Justice. We're not. I don't know why you're saying all this sort of BBC claptrap.
No,
we're not going to be paying in. We're not going to be paying in.
If it's claptrap, it's the Prime Minister's claptrap.
We're not going to be paying in. We're not going to be paying in after we come out. Yes, there will be an implementation period, but after we come out, we'll have what is effectively a gigantic free trade deal with all sorts of bolt-ons. And the advantage of the new arrangements, as the Prime Minister spelt out at Mansion House, is that it will be possible for either side to do things differently, to do things in their own way, and so there will be an independent arbitration panel that will be able to decide whether. Can I just finish the point? So you just respect me.
Okay.
There will be an independent arbitration panel that will be able to decide whether or not there is a distortion of trade entailed. So we have, you know, on money, on borders, on laws, you are seeing the fulfilment of the pledge to take back control.
We have also taken back. We have to take back control of the clock and the time because we have run out of time. Boris Johnson, for now, thank you very much indeed.
I've got the Shadow Chancellor sitting by my desk, so I'm delighted to be joined by him. John, lovely to see you this morning. It won't surprise you that we're going to kick off with Russia, and a very simple question. You personally, do you blame Putin for this attack, this attempted poisoning?
Yeah, I agree with the Prime Minister. I agree completely with the Prime Minister. What she said is that Russia is culpable either by direct commission, either Putin's ordered this, or they've lost control of their supplies.
So just to be clear, she has now backed away from the thesis that they've lost control. She is holding him personally responsible.
Yeah. Well,
you're not agreeing with her.
No, I do agree with her. I agree. She's repeated that statement 3 times now. He is responsible. Whichever way you look at it, he is responsible, and all the evidence points to him.
But hang on a second, there are degrees of culpability. She is saying that he is culpable because it's an act of aggression on British soil by the Russian state. She has broadly dismissed the idea that somehow this has got, you know, that some rogue elements have got hold of this.
Well, the point about that is we have to demonstrate to the international community the evidence for that, and then we can build that coalition. Look, you may remember this, like back in 2006, I campaigned for Anna Politkovskaya when she got killed, the journalist. Yep. I was secretary of the NUJ. There are people being murdered on a regular basis. Anyone who opposes the regime or who exposes the corruption, they've been murdered systematically. This has been going on for years.
So just to be clear and unambiguous on this, unlike the Chief of Strategy for Jeremy Corbyn, Seamus Milne, you have an unambiguous view that Putin is a dangerous and bad leader.
That's exactly what we've all said, and you mentioned Seamus Milne, that's exactly what he said as well. He's repeated time and time again that we support exactly what the Prime Minister said, and we condemn Russia for this, condemn them. I believe this is a pattern of behaviour we've seen. As I said, way back in 2006, I was flagging this up and have done on campaign after campaign. Jeremy, way back in 1999, actually, on Chechnya, led the campaign of condemning Putin about what he was doing, murdering people in Chechnya then.
But what do you think is more likely? OK, let's put it this way. What is more likely, that this was either ordered by Putin and a part of his machine, or that they simply lost control of this awful nerve agent and somehow the mafia or some rogue element got hold of it? What's most likely?
Well, I think it's important that we base our judgments on the evidence.
Where does the evidence direct?
It's important that we base this on the evidence. But there's a pattern of people being murdered here.
So?
Pattern. So therefore it leads you to the conclusion that Putin has questions to answer, because this is highly likely this could be a state execution. But What we don't do in this country is that we don't leap to conclusions without the evidence. And what we're saying to our international partners, working with the chemical weapons inspectors as well, working with Porton Down, we've got to now produce, we will now produce the evidence that leads us to a judgment that they can rely upon. In that way, we can effectively build the coalition. If we leap to conclusions without the evidence, people it will undermine the ability to build that international coalition. So therefore, the point that Jeremy was making the other day is we have to be careful how we handle this if we're going to be really effective in tackling Putin and the barbaric acts that his regime is undertaking.
Now, Seamus Milne, as I'm sure you know, told journalists that there were reasons to mistrust what the intelligence services were saying about this because they got it wrong in Iraq.
No,
do you agree with that?
No, what he said...
No, I was there. I heard him say it. It is what he said.
What he was saying is how you interpret the evidence, and that's the most important thing. Whatever evidence is there, it's how you interpret it. The key thing now is we agree with the Prime Minister. Whatever happens, Russia is responsible for this.
Have you seen all the intelligence you need to see?
No. There will be further, I'm sure, Privy Council...
Will you put in a request to see more of the intelligence?
Of course I will. I'm a Privy Council member, so therefore, as other Privy Council members have the right to do it, to see more of that evidence.
And will Jeremy Corbyn also ask to see more of the evidence?
Well, he has done. But
he hasn't seen it yet.
He's had one briefing under the Privy Council auspices, and others will take place. The key issue for us now is, look, Prime Minister's right. Russia's to blame. Whatever they say, Russia's to blame. So now we've got to build, exactly as she is doing, the international coalition that takes effective action. What Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, said, kicking out diplomats is symbolic. It has to be done, and we support that.
Yep.
But what really hits them is the economic sanctions.
And you want a new tax?
Well, there's a whole range of things that we put forward. I put forward in the general election, by the way, a levy...
Hang on, your colleagues have just emailed me saying that you're going to be calling for a new tax. So that is right,
yes,
you are calling for a new tax on the oligarchs.
In the general election, we said we wanted to introduce a levy on properties owned by foreign companies in tax havens. A lot of those are Russian oligarch owns. So we want
it's not specifically for Russian oligarchs, it's just it's broadly a tax on those.
We know from the evidence so far, at least a quarter of it will be for Russian oligarchs. But also, we want the Magnitsky clause, but we put it in amendments up to legislation 4 weeks ago. The government opposed it. They're now accepting that. This has got to be tough action. Hit them in their pockets. That's where it'll be effective.
So just very briefly, because we're about to run into the break, but you've got your great friend from your own benches, Chris Leslie, over there, saying that he felt that the tone of what Jeremy Corbyn said earlier this week, where he attacked the government, for example, cuts to Foreign Office spending, was just inappropriate at that moment. This should have been a moment where the parties came together in the face of this threat from the Russians.
It is. I think it's the role of a responsible opposition to ensure that they have an honest critique of the government, what they're doing, support them when they're right, and that's what Jeremy did. He said, I support and condemn these actions, supported the Prime Minister on her conclusions.
But do you understand why some people, including those in your own party, felt uncomfortable at seeing him attack the Prime Minister at that moment?
It wasn't an attack, it was a critique. It was asking questions about investment in diplomacy, it was asking questions about where we go from here and building the international coalition. That's what oppositions do, and it was a constructive critique. I think others have misread that.
And we'll stick with this story because the Foreign Secretary has been speaking on the Andrew Marr show this morning. He was asked how the government could be certain that the Russian government was responsible for the attack.
We actually have evidence within the last 10 years that Russia has not only been investigating the delivery of nerve agents for the purposes of assassination, but has also been creating and stockpiling Novichok. To the best of our knowledge, this is a Russian-made nerve agent that falls within the category Novichok, made only by Russia.
Well, I'm joined now from Rutland by the Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan. Thank you for talking to us this morning. Russia have responded, as you know, to our expulsion of 23 of their diplomats by expelling 23 of ours, closing British Council offices there and the consulate in St. Petersburg. Is there now a second phase of government action that will need to be introduced in order to take this further?
Well, we have lots of options. But this isn't just about counting heads. This is really about making it clear to the world that one of the great achievements of the world since the Second World War, which is a convention to ban chemical weapons, has been violated. And it is clearly traceable back to a military-grade nerve agent of Russian origin. And we said to the Russians, well, either you did it directly, or you've lost control of this, you know, tell us which. They just basically sort of stuck their tongue out at us. And their irresponsible response to this, I think, points ever more to them as having done this. And so the response that we've done, I think, is proportionate. Yes, they've responded back. But what matters more than anything else is not that we go into some kind of tit-for-tat stuff by counting exact numbers and things like that. It's that we actually corral the whole world to realise that Russia is totally out of order here and that the Chemical Weapons Convention has been violated in a way which could do enormous damage to the world in any country.
Okay, so if you're talking about concerted international action...
And that's what we're going to do.
So concerted international action,
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You're calling for concerted international action. What would that look like?
Well, we're already very grateful to the very clear response we've had from a lot of countries. I mean, I was just in the Balkans over the weekend with countries like, you know, Macedonia and Kosovo, and they were very, very clear in their condemnation of this because they themselves are countries which suffer from wider Russian interference. But we've got the EU foreign ministers meeting tomorrow. There will be at Prime Minister level the March European Council on Friday. We've already had an open discussion in the UN at which the Russian representative cut a very, very lonely figure. And this is clearly a Russian violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and will cooperate with the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to prove even further what we know to be the case.
When it comes to international action, though, Sir Roderick Lyne is a former UK ambassador to Russia, agrees with you that we need to take action in concert with others. He says the sanctions imposed by the EU after Crimea in 2014 surprised the Kremlin and continue to have an impact because they were EU-wide. But he went on to say that Brexit's now made Britain's task harder in appealing for EU solidarity this week in the kind of international action you're looking for.
No, I think that's total nonsense. I think that Brexit does not have an effect on this. After all, we're still a member of the EU, and we operate our EU sanctions collectively. We're also at the moment passing legislation through the House of Commons, which will give us an autonomous sanctions regime following our departure from the EU. And we will include in that, by the way, what I hope will be a firm cross-party statement from the House of Commons that the Magnitsky clauses people have been campaigning for will be included in the sanctions and anti-money laundering bill.
Okay, well, let me pick you up on those Magnitsky clauses. All the way through the passage of this bill, which predated the Salisbury incident, has always been something we wanted the whole of the House Commons to do, not just something in a committee during the passage of the bill. Really? Because, I mean, Labour tried to introduce an amendment to that bill with a Magnitsky clause. You were the minister in the bill committee that rejected those amendments just 2 weeks ago.
Well, I've just explained, I've answered that question actually before you asked the question, which is that we wanted it to be done on the whole floor of the House, and actually the phrasing of the bill, of the amendment, wasn't we thought consistent with some of the other parts of the Act. That's a technical thing. But we have an understanding, which I hope will be a cross-party thing, and that will send a clear message to the world that the House of Commons, along with countries who have done it already, will be aligned with the Magnitsky proposal which campaigners have been wanting.
But when you look at those Magnitsky powers, they would allow you to take action against individuals who were guilty of gross human rights violations. That doesn't necessarily allow you to attack the funds of Putin allies who have stashed millions of pounds in London properties here, unless you can find them guilty of gross human rights violations. So it wouldn't really allow you to respond to this attack, would it?
Well, again, I'm afraid you're totally wrong and don't understand the wording of the bill, because it's not only gross human rights violations which are in that bill. There are many, many purposes which are included in the list of things you can do under that legislation, and it does include what you've just described.
Well, but the powers that the government has already in going after things like this, like unexplained wealth orders, have been used only once since they were introduced. There hasn't been much evidence until this incident in Salisbury that the government were serious about tackling corrupt money that's washing through London.
Well, that's because the legislation has only recently come in. And, of course, it's not politicians who make these decisions. You see, there's a massive distinction here between the liberal democracy in which we live, where judges and the law take their course separately from politicians. And what we think is happening in Russia, which is an illiberal, not real democracy. We're looking at a pretty odd election taking place today where Vladimir Putin would undoubtedly be supposedly re-elected for the 4th time. And that is a deep distinction between our values and their values. And one of the great values that we have seen in the world is the creation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn's always been the great disarmer. And here we have a violation of the ideological, the sort of principled convention that has been built up over many decades, violated in our own country, which is why I think many young people are very disappointed with his response.
Ben Wallace, the Security Minister, said this week that we've allowed nasty individuals to come to the City of London and launder illicit money. That sounds like an admission that until now this government hasn't really been doing enough to tackle corrupt money in London.
Look, I think we're amassing all the powers to be able to tackle exactly the kind of issue that Ben Wallace has identified. And indeed, he's the Security Minister who has been, you know, supporting this, pressing for it and administering it from the Home Office point of view. We have to make a proper distinction, though, without compromising our values, between those who are guilty and those who are not. And not every oligarch is guilty, and not every person who happens to be a rich Russian is necessarily a crony of Putin and therefore someone who should be subject to sanctions. So we need to approach this without compromising our values. But there is something much more important than this. What really matters is that the world needs to realise that if we allow chemical weapons to slip into use any more that's happened now, we are going to live in a much more dangerous world, and one which is just tearing up the rule book, throwing away the Chemical Weapons Convention, which has been in place for so many decades. Indeed, it was one of the great idealistic achievements of the post-war world that we've put this in place. So we have to be so robust across all countries in pointing the finger at Russia and to say that this violation by the use of chemical weapons is simply not acceptable.
Sir Alan Duncan, thank you very much for that. Well, earlier this week, the police announced that they were launching a murder inquiry into the death of another Russian businessman living in Britain. A pathologist report says that Nikolai Glushkov died of compression to the neck after being found dead at his home on Monday. The Metropolitan Police say there's no evidence to suggest a link to the attempted murder of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, but the Home Office has announced it will investigate a number of other unexplained deaths following the Skripal case. Yvette Cooper is the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee and is here to talk to me now.
Good morning.
You had specifically asked the Home Secretary to investigate 14 other deaths that you're worried may have had Russian involvement. Do you have much evidence for that?
Well, my concern was that I think any area now where there are allegations that there may have been either Russian involvement or there were suspicious circumstances that may need to be investigated should be, because I think we have to have the full facts. There was a BuzzFeed investigation that made allegations about 14 cases. There are other concerns that have been raised about others. I think it's not for me to judge the individual circumstances. My concern is that these cases, though, where there have been conclusions or preliminary conclusions of suicide or natural causes or accident, that actually there may be some further evidence that of actually some more suspicious circumstances. They should now be reviewed by the Home Office and by the police.
And the Home Office have said that they will do that.
Yes.
But if you look at the case of Alexander Paraplinsky, who died in 2012, Amber Rudd says she'll investigate it. Surrey Police says they're not going to reopen the investigation. So will they be able to uncover any new evidence?
So I assume that the Home Office will ensure that there is a proper review now of all of these cases. I think the Home Secretary will, as she said in her letter to me, want to satisfy herself that every corner has been looked into and that this has been done properly and that we get to the bottom of this. I do, however, accept that the priority for them at the moment must be this current investigation and the current, obviously, circumstances in Salisbury and where those investigations lead. But they will need, I think, to follow up by looking at these other cases as well.
So do you have any doubt that what happened in Salisbury was directed by the Russian state?
I think I share the conclusions, I think, of the French and German government as well as the British government, that it is just implausible that the Russian state wasn't involved in some way or another. What we don't know yet...
So Jeremy Corbyn is wrong when he continues to equivocate and say it was either the Russian state or a chemical weapon that got out of control and into other people's hands.
Well, what we don't know yet is which individuals caused the attack and how the nerve agent was distributed or how it was brought into the country. We also don't know which bit of the Russian state was particularly involved, but I think the clear evidence, the way in which the Russian government has been behaving since and since this happened, really is not the behaviour of a government that is saying, no, you know, we weren't involved and we want to help get to the bottom of this because we take it seriously. Just this morning, the Russian embassy has been tweeting pictures of Hercule Poirot linked to this. I mean, they are effectively trolling us on this. They're not responding in a way that is serious and statesperson-like.
So are you rather embarrassed by Jeremy Corbyn and even John McDonnell also on the television this morning saying there isn't enough evidence to link this to the Kremlin?
Well, I think what John McDonnell said this morning, I agree with. He said that we should condemn the Russian government for the way it's behaved on this, and he said that the Russian government is responsible. And I think, in fact, he went further than Theresa May has gone by, I think, pointing the finger particularly at Putin. Something reflects something similar to what Boris Johnson has said. So I think that there is a recognition that even though we don't know which individual delivered the nerve agent, actually there is responsibility here in the Russian government, the Russian state, and I think in some part of the security service is what we expect as well.
It was really clear in the House of Commons this week that there were senior Labour MPs like yourselves uncomfortable with Jeremy Corbyn's position. That was obvious from what you said during the debate. There's also been reports that this has been seen as a watershed moment by some moderate Labour MPs wondering what they're doing in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party and has revived talk of a breakaway party, possibly including some Lib Dems, maybe even some Conservatives. Is that something you've heard about?
So I think this is a load of rubbish. I mean, certainly I would have no truck with it even if it wasn't a load of rubbish, but I have not heard this. And so I think this is sort of in danger of spiralling ever outwards. And I think we're also in danger as well of making this an issue about domestic politics at a time when there's some very serious international issues here that we should be focusing on and also should be coming together to focus on as well.
But that's exactly why it becomes a domestic issue, isn't it? Because it's at times like this you might expect the Leader of the Opposition to back up the Prime Minister. You were clearly very uncomfortable with the way Jeremy Corbyn did not do that, so it inevitably has consequences for relations within the Labour Party.
Well, so what Jeremy, as I understand it, Jeremy's position is that he has said that he, I think that the evidence points to Russia, that also that he supports all of the measures, and that's really important, that you have, I think, some unanimity about the measures and the action that needs to be taken, and also calling for some further action, particularly around the financial and economic sanctions. Now, I understood his position to be that he wanted to wait for some further evidence before going further and criticising the Russian government. Obviously, John McDonnell has very strongly criticised the Russian government today. But look, I'm not going to criticise Jeremy for taking a slightly different view, because I think there's been a little bit too much temperature in this, and you've heard people being called warmongers for condemning the Russian state. You've also heard people being called appeasers for asking further questions. None of that helps. We're not talking about military action. We're talking about a series of systematic diplomatic measures, international cooperation measures, criminal investigation measures, and I hope that actually there can be unanimity about what those measures should be.
All right, Yvette Cooper, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us this morning. I'll just pick up some of that with the panel. Lucy Fisher, I mean, it's been clear listening to Yvette Cooper there, listening to Shami Chakrabarti on Andrew Marr this morning, John McDonnell, very much within the Labour Party, people who really seem to be at odds with each other at the beginning of the week are trying to say there's absolutely nothing to see here. We are on the same page on this. Is that true?
I'm not entirely convinced. I think that this whole issue has opened up old wounds in the Labour Party. The fragile truce, particularly on Jeremy Corbyn's front bench, has been strained by his response. And I think while we were talking earlier about how some of the questions in which he has asked are valid and legitimate questions, tonally, I think the response has upset a lot of Labour MPs, primarily those who've tabled this early day motion calling for the Commons to unequivocally condemn the Russian state.
Matt Cousins, though, I mean, Alan Duncan there seemed to be saying that the government were wanting to introduce the Magnitsky powers and other ways of going after corrupt money in London, exactly what Labour have been calling for, which suggests maybe Jeremy Corbyn's on the right side of this argument. Yeah,
I think if you really want to impose meaningful sanctions, then you have to follow the money. You have to go.
And so, were you satisfied with what you heard from Alan Duncan?
No, I think the proposals that they're putting forward, I think, are really watered down compared to what Labour had proposed in the manifesto in the last general election. But I think there is an agreement among the Labour Party now and the front bench, particularly, that the Russian state is culpable And I think that is the agreement that's shared across the House. You're still culpable under the Chemical Weapons Convention if you lose control of a nerve agent, which is what either happened or the Russian state sanctioned the murder or the attempted murder.
And Isabel, are the Conservative government, do you think, serious about financial powers in order to target corrupt money? David Cameron said one of his great regrets in office was that he never introduced these Magnitsky powers. The government didn't want to accept Labour's amendment a couple of weeks ago. Now they say that they're going to go ahead with it. Is it powers that they will use in a meaningful way?
Well, I think they're absolutely serious. I mean, certainly the National Security Advisor, Mark Sedwill, absolutely understands this, as does Ben Wallace, the Intelligence Minister. He has been very much all over this. They have already used these new powers about freezing the assets for unexplained wealth. That has a fairly new measure which has already been implemented in at least one case, as I understand it. But I just want to come back on your comment there, which, you know, you say that now the Labour Party is singing as one. I just don't pick that up from the rhetoric. I felt that Yvette Cooper was extraordinarily diplomatic, very impressively so, but trying to paper over serious cracks within the parliamentary party about Labour's position on this. It is quite clear that Jeremy Corbyn does still doubt the intelligence on it.
Matt?
I think it's not the intelligence that he doubts, it's the way the intelligence has been interpreted by the government, and I'm talking about intelligence that he perhaps hasn't seen. So we don't know how much he's seen of you know, Theresa May did, as Lucy's story showed this week, hasn't necessarily shown the Leader of the Opposition and Chief of Staff everything. So I think it's the same as Iraq in a sense. It's like, it's not the intelligence itself necessarily, it's how the government uses the intelligence, and that's what comes back to the nerve agent being of a type developed by Russia. Now, how much do we read into that? It's not necessarily coming from Russia.
Okay.
Time in office. Meanwhile, of course, in Salisbury, we should not forget Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia remain critically ill in hospital. In just a moment, I'll be joined by the Conservative Party chairman, Brandon Lewis. We'll be asking the Labour Party chairman, Ian Lavery, about the perceived mixed messages coming from the shadow front bench just this week. We'll be discussing the government and indeed the Russian response with the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. And ahead of what will be a huge week in the Brexit talks, we'll once again be talking to the RBS chairman, Sir Howard Davies. But first, the Prime Minister this week pointed the finger of blame squarely at the Kremlin following the attempted murder of a former Russian double agent and his daughter in Salisbury 2 weeks ago. Moscow has responded by expelling diplomats and forcing the British Council to close. The UK is expected to outline further measures, including possible sanctions tomorrow. I'm joined now by the Conservative Party chairman, Brandon Lewis. Mr Lewis, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
According to Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn has let down his party and his country by aiding the Russian propaganda machine. I mean, in what way is that helpful? Actually, forget that. In what way is that true?
Well, I think many people who saw what the leader of the Labour Party said on Monday were surprised. I think some of his own side were disappointed at the way he reacted, and certainly when he went and continued that position on Wednesday. And actually, I have to say, across the House, I think what is important, across the House of Commons, there was unanimity and support for the position the government's taken, the position the Prime Minister's taken, where the real focus has to be on giving some confidence and security and thinking about the safety of people, particularly, obviously, people in Salisbury.
But how is that letting down the country? I mean, that's just jingoistic nonsense, isn't it? I mean, the situation, as initially described by Theresa May, was pretty clear. Either the Russian state was responsible for events in Salisbury or Russian criminal gangs who had somehow acquired the nerve agent. Now, as I read things this morning, the situation is still exactly the same as described by Theresa May, isn't it?
Yes, as Theresa May, the Prime Minister, has outlined herself, that's very clearly where the evidence points, and we made the point to Russia and asked Russia to respond to that, and we saw, as the Prime Minister outlined on Wednesday, we didn't get the sort of response we would have hoped to have got, and it's right that we do, and the Prime Minister was absolutely right on Wednesday to outline a series of actions in order to make sure that we do the right thing by the people of the United Kingdom, and also working with our partners internationally to work to get a good international agreement around how we go forward, because this is something that can affect any country, anywhere, if that evidence is correct.
As you just said, there is no fresh intelligence that implicates the Russian Premier, the Russian state.
as opposed to Russian criminal gangs. So again, I ask this question because language is important in times like this. In what way has Jeremy Corbyn let down the country by condemning events in Salisbury in the strongest possible terms and pointing the finger of suspicion at the Russians?
Well, actually, I think if you look back, the point the Prime Minister was making last week, and the point that the agencies have made, is that the evidence points towards the Russian state. And if it isn't the Russian state directly, then it is arguably because they have lost control of nerve gases and their system. And therefore, there is a responsibility for the Russian state. And that's why it's very clear. The Prime Minister's point was asking the Russian state to respond to this in a proper way that is internationally acceptable and also, from our point of view, of course, protecting the safety and security of people in the United Kingdom.
I mean, Mr Lewis, I'll note that once again you're studiously avoiding the point made by Boris Johnson that Jeremy Corbyn has in some way let down the country with the response that he gave in the House of Commons. I mean, look at the questions that he asked of Theresa May, many of which, frankly, I would have asked myself if I'd had the opportunity to put them to Theresa May after her statement. You know, what action is being taken with the OCPW? Can the Prime Minister outline the discussion she's had with NATO, EU, UN, their willingness for multilateral action? That's letting down the country. What discussion has she had with the Russian government? That's letting down the country.
Well, actually, I think if you look at what happened in the House of Commons, both on Monday and Wednesday last week, was Labour backbencher after Labour backbencher backing the Prime Minister, and there was a very clear distancing between themselves and their leader, and actually even some of the front bench in some of their comments, arguably, I would say, stepping away from the position and the manner in which the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, made his points. And the Prime Minister was very clear, actually, that she has been and is continuing to work with our international partners, including NATO and others. And obviously, as we've heard this morning, we've got to the chemical weapons being assessed, and the international agencies looking at coming to this country tomorrow to look at that. But it's very clear where the evidence points, and that's why the point was made that it is right that the Russian state should respond to that in a sensible way to support and help the work that we are doing on this. And we didn't see that happen, and that's why the Prime Minister took the actions that she did on Wednesday that she outlined to Parliament.
Yeah, again, Mr Lewis, I'll note that you haven't been able to point to any of the questions asked by the leader of the opposition, after all, after Theresa May's statement, as inappropriate or in some way, you know, traitorous, treacherous, letting down the country. Actually, the point made by Mr Corbyn, which caused the most consternation on your side of the chamber, was when he said, well, he asked the Prime Minister whether or not she thought it was essential to maintain a robust dialogue with Russia in the interest of national security. I mean, we are maintaining a robust dialogue. Theresa May agrees with Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, is Theresa May letting down the country?
Theresa May, I think, if you look at the response we've seen this week, has highlighted in the way that she has dealt with this situation exactly why she is such a good Prime Minister for this country. I think she has dealt with this absolutely superbly, and the view of the British people seems to be one that absolutely concurs with the fact that she has taken absolutely the right action, both for us nationally and the work that she did when she's been in Salisbury herself. And she has made the point that we need to continue our role within NATO, because there are issues around the world where we need to work with our NATO partners, but that doesn't defer from the fact that we need to take a very strong position around what seems to be a foreign state's action on our territory. And we absolutely have to make the point that we've got to make sure that the security of the people of this country comes absolutely first and centre. And I did make the point in answering your previous question, in fact, more than once, that if you look at the tone and the way that things were discussed in the House of Commons, it was clear that there are members of the Labour Party, this is a matter for them, it's not something for me to comment on, that were taking a very different tone and position to that of their leader. And I leave that for other people to take a view about.
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about tone, I mean, isn't the truth of what Boris Johnson was doing when he suggested that Jeremy Corbyn had let down the country, what you're doing right now, is all of a piece with that idiotic, defamatory tweet sent by Ben Bradley in which he said Jeremy Corbyn sold British secrets to communist spies. I mean, you, Mr Johnson, have clearly learned a lesson. You're not going to have to make a grovelling apology. You're not going to have to pay substantial damages. But you're all making the same point.
Well, actually, I think there's a really important point here. If you look at the tweet that Ben Bradley made, which he himself accepted was a mistake, and before anybody forced him to do so, he deleted it. He then apologised. No. He deleted that very, very quickly. He also apologised, and yes, he has had to pay a substantial sum to charity. But we do see things coming from the hard left, and indeed, just last weekend from Labour MPs, that even when they do delete it, they don't apologise. They certainly don't make donations to charity. And I think there's a vast difference between a statement that was made that's been apologised for and reparation has been made to some of the social attacks and actually the abuse we see of people from people on the hard left, often on social media, which is completely unacceptable. And it's why we as a party have said that for these local elections, which are upon us in the next few weeks, we will have a respect code. And if our candidates don't abide by that, we will deal with that and we will suspend them.
It strikes me that you don't realise just how dangerous this type of language is. I mean, the rhetoric you choose at a time when, you know, 3 people have come very close to death as the result of the deployment of a nerve agent. I mean, isn't what Mr Johnson said of Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, isn't it awfully similar to what the Russians say about Sergei Skripal, you know, that he's failed the country, that he's a traitor?
Well, actually, I think what the Foreign Secretary was outlining, and as I've said several times over the last few minutes, is if you look at what was said, and I would encourage your viewers to go onto Parliament TV and look at what was said in the House of Commons, both on Monday and on Wednesday, by people from right across the House, and the overwhelming support, the unanimous pretty much support, but it seems to be with the exception of the Labour leader, was for the position and the actions taken by our Prime Minister Theresa May. I think she's doing absolutely the right thing. And I say I would leave people to look at what was said, look at the manner in which it's been said, the way that the Labour leader has conducted himself, and I think they can draw their own conclusions.
Why was it wrong for Mr Corbyn to point out that the Conservatives had accepted over £800,000 from, you know, some pretty dodgy-looking people and companies with direct links to the Kremlin, despite the fact that Theresa May had promised to distance herself from Russian donors? I mean, why was that inappropriate?
Well, because actually, these are British citizens. We absolutely abide by all of the rules that donations have to go on. They're all fully declared, they're in the public domain. And actually, these are British citizens, many of whom will have actually potentially fled Russia because they do not support the Russian state's position and President Putin's position. And somebody who's a British citizen or a British company does have the right as a British citizen, and we should defend their right to play a full part in British society, and we should not.
So Theresa May didn't say that she was going to distance herself from Russian donors.
You're missing a very key point here. We only accept donations from properly approved donors who go through due diligence, who are
lobbyists for Moscow, the wife of a former Putin minister,
who are
companies
British
with links
citizens.
to banks that are under EU sanction.
And all of these have due diligence, they're properly declared, they are in line with the Electoral Commission, and let's be very clear, these are British citizens, and this issue is not an issue, as the Prime Minister herself has very clearly said, where we have an issue with the Russian people, and certainly not Russian people who have come to this country, made their lives and become British citizens. This is an issue with the behaviour of the Russian state, as it seems to be from those actions just about 10 days ago.
£160,000 to play tennis with Boris Johnson. £160,000 to play a game of tennis. I mean, doesn't the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, Marina, have a point when she says that these donations were calculated? It certainly looks that way. I mean, she certainly has a point when she says that, you know, Theresa May has failed in her promise to do all within her power to ensure that there wouldn't be a repeat of what happened to her husband.
No, absolutely. The Prime Minister was quite right in what she has said. And if you look at what we are doing and the changes we made through the Criminal Finance Act, the Prime Minister outlined last week in taking forward some changes and amendments in law going forward and the use of unexplained wealth orders. This is a government that is dealing with that kind of criminal money, and it is absolutely right we do so. But there's a very separate issue, and we shouldn't confuse the two things. All political parties raise their funds. They do some of that through fundraising events. And we do only take funds from British citizens. And there is a big difference between the Russian state, the Russian people, and, of course, people who are British citizens.
But just to be clear, as party chairman, you're telling me today that despite Theresa May promising to distance herself from Russian donors, you'll be more than happy to take their money in the future?
I'm absolutely clear that we only take money from people who are British citizens, British registered, and abide by all of the rules of the Electoral Commission. And it is absolutely right that we do not stop British citizens from having the ability to fully participate in British society, and that includes politics as well.
Brandon Lewis, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
There is considerable uncertainty in the city at the moment, and not just because of Brexit. The prospect of financial sanctions being imposed on Russia and the possibility of reprisals from Moscow could have a considerable impact. Joining me now, the chairman of RBS, Sir Howard Davies. Sir Howard, lovely to see you again. Just on that point, how convinced are you that the city, that the financial services in this country are doing all they can to ensure probity when it comes to money leaving Russia?
Well, there has been a massive investment in anti-money laundering procedures in the city in recent years. It's estimated now that the city spends over £1 billion on producing suspicious transaction reports, where we are given intelligence that there may be an issue about a particular client or individual. So I'm comfortable that the city is submitting a lot of information. The question is, of course, whether we're given, the intelligence that we need to know who we're looking for. And then there's a second question, which is sanctions. And there, I think, when there are sanctions imposed through the Bank of England, the city is very rigorous about it because breaching sanctions is real trouble. But, of course, we haven't got a blanket sanctions arrangement for Russia at the moment.
The accusation has often been not necessarily that the banks themselves were out looking to incriminate themselves, but that they perhaps overlooked money that perhaps at first glance should have raised more than eyebrows.
Well, in regulated British banks, the penalties for overlooking things are very high indeed, and we are extremely risk averse, and so we err on the side of caution and prudence in submitting what are called STR, suspicious transaction reports. Whenever we get some money in, we're not sure of the origins of it, we submit a report on it. Then, of course, it's a question of what the authorities, and particularly the security services, do with all that information. But I'm pretty confident that the information is supplied to them by British banks.
Now, the last time we had you on the programme, you suggested that the businesses, in particular the financial services sector, needed to have clarity as to the transition period arrangements by the end of Q1 2018. Handily enough, that's almost where we are. So have you got enough clarity?
Not quite. We are waiting for the deal, which, of course, the government is trying to agree this week at the summit in Brussels. Will that deal give sufficient legal certainty to banks and others in the city to allow them to assume that they can carry on with their existing business arrangements through to the end of the transition period? So that's the first focus. And in that, one thing is the deal itself, but secondly is what the regulators do. Now, the one bit of relatively new news, if you like, since we last discussed this, is that the Bank of England have said, well, they will give comfort to firms based on the transition deal, even if it isn't signed in blood as a legal document, that we can rely on it as regulatory underpinning, is the phrase they've used, up to the end of the transition period. So that's good news, and that takes some of the pressure off. But, of course, we still don't know what the deal will be after the transition period.
It sounds awfully like to me that you're suggesting that the banks will have to go ahead with their contingency plans on the basis of what we know currently.
Well, perhaps a bit more slowly than before, because if we have a standstill, if transition means standstill, in other words, that we stay with the same rules as we've got through to the end of 2020, which I think is the Commission's, European Commission's proposition, then that does give you a bit more time. But, of course, you still need to have a look at what the eventual deal is going to be. And there isn't so much clarity. I mean, the Chancellor has set out what he would want, based on mutual recognition of regulations between European countries. But the initial response from the EU 27 to that has not been good.
So would you then agree with the report from the Dexio Committee today, suggesting that we need more time?
Well, I think that they are probably focused on goods rather than on financial services. And in the case of goods, of course, there could be the need for, border posts and huge parking lots for lorries. I think that's the real practicality. Financial services is not quite like that. If you suddenly faced a cliff edge, you'd have to move people very quickly into another city, but the issue would be, finding apartments. It wouldn't be, building huge facilities. So I doubt if, from a city point of view, it's going to be financial services that drive the need for a longer transition.
It does, though. Do the words of Theresa May on passporting or the absence of, as we move forward? I mean, obviously, as regards your business, not necessarily the most important thing, but it's clearly going to have an effect.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I mean, we will probably have to set up a subsidiary in Amsterdam to deal with our European clients, our EU 27 clients, for whom we do foreign exchange, business, we arrange loans, we manage transactions for them, and we will probably need to do that through a subsidiary based in Amsterdam. So we've got contingency plans for doing that.
How soon?
Well, it would depend on how long the transition period is, but I imagine from the end of 2020.
Sir Howard Davies, many thanks for joining us once again. Now, the National Security Council will meet tomorrow to discuss the UK's response to Russia's expulsion of 23 British diplomats as the tit-for-tat escalates. Join me now, the former Foreign Secretary, former Defence Secretary, former Head of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Sir Malcolm, many thanks for being with us. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Just in terms of what you've heard from the government so far, in terms of the expulsion of diplomats, in terms of the sanctions and so on, has our response been proportionate, given the fact that we are still in a situation this morning where the government cannot be definitive that the Russian state was responsible for what happened in Salisbury?
Well, hold on. It can be as definitive as is remotely possible in these sort of circumstances. We have a very specialist nerve agent which has been identified as being Novichok. We know that that has only been manufactured in what was then the Soviet Union in a factory in Uzbekistan. It should all have been destroyed in the 1990s. And we find that it's now being used to attempt to kill people in the streets of one of our cities. Now, either the Russian government authorized it or they allowed the material to get into the hands of those who did.
Given that, should we not perhaps have been slightly stronger than the expulsion of diplomats?
It's difficult to know what you're referring to. First of all, the number of diplomats that were expelled was 40%, almost half, of the Russian embassy. That's a higher proportion than any previous occasion when diplomats have been expelled. In addition, we're not naive. The government knows perfectly well the Russians were likely to retaliate, as has now happened. And therefore, I'm assuming, and I think I've got every reason, as we all have, to assume, there will be a second package of measures announced in the very near future.
Isn't it the case, though, Sir Malcolm, that the only reason we're pushing forward with the Magnitsky proposals is because of events in Salisbury?
Well, we are doing two things. We are looking at... I'm not in the government, so I'm anticipating what the government is likely to be doing. But
indeed,
the government is doing two things. It is looking at what is inherently linked to the cause of this crisis. And when we are dealing with a Russian attack on people in a British city, then now is the time, for example, to take very tough measures. Perhaps they should have been taken earlier against some of Putin's cronies who are friends, part of his inner circle, who live in London or who have property or assets in London and need to be dealt with, because Putin is not just a one-man state. He is surrounded by cronies, by some oligarchs, some of whom have links with the United Kingdom, and action can be taken against their assets. That will hurt, and indirectly it will hurt Putin as well. The Magnitsky affair, I think that should have been dealt with at an earlier stage, and that is measures that punish individuals from the Russian state who are believed to be responsible for serious human rights violations.
Well, in a sense, then, as you were saying, some of these proposals could have been pushed forward earlier. I mean, is there a sense...
I said one of the proposals.
Yeah,
not
indeed. Sorry, apologies. Is there a sense, then, in which the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has taken its eye off the ball somewhat? I mean, in the past few years, we've had Crimea, we've had Ukraine, Malaysia Airlines 17. You know, we know, for example, that there were troops operating in the east of Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russian Premier said that they weren't. He has lied on a number of occasions. Should we have been tougher sooner, a lot tougher sooner? Have they taken
all the other examples you've mentioned were not specific attacks on the United Kingdom, including a United Kingdom citizen. They were Russia's international policy, and therefore it required a NATO response and an international response. And there was a response. The European Union is imposing on Russia over Ukraine, and we were very instrumental in bringing this about, the toughest sanctions Russia has ever faced.
What do you make of the
financial and banking sanctions? I'm banned from Russia at the moment for having been one of those calling for these sanctions.
And I'm sure it was on your to-do list to head to Moscow sometime soon as well. In terms of what Boris Johnson has said about Jeremy Corbyn, there's been a huge focus on the way in which the leader of the opposition responded, from his own backbenches as much as the Conservative benches. But do you believe that perhaps that the Foreign Secretary went just a little bit too far when he claimed that Mr Corbyn had let down his country?
Well, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. I'm hoping someone in our office will be able to bring you some water.
And colourful language is often used, and that's what happened on this occasion.
Colourful language, though. I mean, it was a point that I was making to your party chairman just a few moments ago. The idea that at a time such as this, rhetoric like that can be deployed. It seems strange that someone like Boris Johnson, fully in command of the English language, would choose to be so sharp.
Well, you say it was so sharp. What's wrong with being sharp? The circumstances justified sharpness, I would have thought. What is it you're objecting to that he said?
Well, he said that he had let down the country, and I'm wondering why, when the questions that he asked were about the involvement of the OPCW, whether or not we'd had conversations with our NATO allies, and whether there was, you know, support for multilateral moving forward. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? We've had lots of fine words from the Americans and many others, but actually, as things stand, the only people that are taking any action are Britain.
No. Look, whenever there has been an attack in the United States or in France or in Germany, obviously the country in question leads the response and hopes that its allies will give it full support. We have had full support from America, from France and Germany. It's interesting, in the first immediate response after Mrs. May's announcement, the French appeared to be rather unhappy about going along with our response. In fact, they reconsidered that, and President Macron has given as much support as President Trump and Angela Merkel. So I don't think we have any cause to be concerned about that.
As someone equally in command of the English language as Boris Johnson, I wonder what you made of Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary's remarks, you know, telling the Russians to shut up and go away.
Well, Gavin Williamson is Defence Secretary, Boris Johnson is Foreign Secretary. I've done both jobs, and what I discovered is when you're in the Foreign Office, you have to be always very, very diplomatic. In the Ministry of Defence, you mix with the military. They can sometimes be blunter in the language they use, and I think Gavin Williamson is perhaps reflecting the culture of the Ministry of Defence more than the traditional, rather specialist diplomatic language which the Foreign Office favours. I think that's a very good answer to your question.
Well, let us both hope that Mr Williamson doesn't get any earthier, shall we? Sir Malcolm Rifkind, many thanks for joining us. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has faced widespread criticism for his apparent reluctance to directly blame the Russian state for the Salisbury attack. A Sky Data poll earlier this week showed that fewer than 1 in 3 thought Mr Corbyn was doing a good job when it came to the issue. More than 60% of those asked backed Theresa May's approach. Joining me now to discuss that and much more, the Labour Party Chairman, Ian Lavery. Very good morning to you, Mr Lavery. Just in terms of the Labour... Yeah, good morning. Can we just be crystal clear? As of this morning, what is the Labour Party's position as to who was responsible for the use of the nerve agent in Salisbury?
Really haven't changed our position since last week, and that is that we firmly believe that it's overwhelmingly likely that this is on the doorstep of the Russian authorities. We firmly agree with what the Prime Minister said, Theresa May, in the House of Commons on Monday and further on Wednesday, when indeed she said there's two potentials, there's two alternatives. One of them would be that this was a direct attack by the Kremlin. The second one would be that it could be as a result of the Kremlin, the Russian authorities, losing control of this particular nerve agent. Now, we believe that that is the case. We've said that. Jeremy is being crystal clear, categoric on that issue. The only big difference is, of course, is that we believe that the action that we should take should be based on evidence and should be decisive and proportionate in what action we decide actually ultimately to take. There's only that small difference. We're pretty much in line with what the government are suggesting.
So you don't accept, then, that there have been conflicting signals from some parts of your party? You know, there have been some who have been more than happy to accept at face value the conclusion, the government's conclusion, that it was the Russian state and, by implication, Vladimir Putin that was responsible. Others, including Seamus Milne, Jeremy Corbyn, at the very least, appear to give the impression that they're equivocal about that.
Well, there's always differences in political parties. The Labour Party isn't any different, and there are dividing lines, particularly when you talk about foreign policy. There's always clear dividing lines in all political parties. But you asked what the position of the Labour Party is, and it's clearly as outlined. We're not too different from what Theresa May has outlined from Monday right through the week. And in fact, Theresa May hasn't she, took on board some of the suggestions that Jeremy made on Monday and on Wednesday in relation to how we should retaliate. On Monday, Jeremy was mocked. On Wednesday, he was mocked. on Sunday morning, the Tory party, the Conservatives, are listening very carefully to what's being said in terms of how we should approach this tit-for-tat response to the Russian authorities.
Okay, indeed.
That's very, very crystal clear.
Indeed, but here's the thing that I'm struggling with. If Mr Corbyn truly believes that there still remains the possibility that Russian criminal gangs were responsible for events in Salisbury, why is he supporting the expulsion of Russian diplomats and their families? You know, if he doesn't believe, or he believes that there exists the possibility that it wasn't the Russian state, why is he supporting sanctions against the Russian state?
Jeremy took the decision to support the actions of the Conservatives to expel the diplomats and the families early last week, because it seemed at that very early stage that the Russian authorities weren't really playing ball with the government. They weren't treating it as seriously as what they should have been. And Jeremy thought that was proportionate.
That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all.
In response to what had been said.
Look, either Mr Corbyn believes that the Russian state is most likely responsible, that's why he supports the action taken by the government, or, as you say, he believes there remains the possibility that Russian criminals actually carried out the attack in Salisbury, you know, and he's supporting the government for reasons of political expediency.
The evidence isn't complete. The evidence might be complete sometime in the very near future. And what Jeremy says, the only difference with what Jeremy says and what the government are saying is that he believes there should be some evidence. What's wrong with securing evidence? We want to have a coalition of partners with the EU, with the United Nations, with NATO, and with our colleagues right across the globe in order to tackle this unacceptable position where we've got oligarchs and the finances flooding on the streets of London, and incidents like we saw in Salisbury. It cannot be tolerated. And
no, indeed not. And no one is suggesting that it should, least of all the government.
That this is undoubtedly the Russian authorities, whether it be option 1, as Theresa May put it, or option 2. We need that evidence now.
Yeah, but there is evidence. There is evidence, and presumably the evidence that Jeremy Corbyn has seen is the same evidence that Emily Thornberry has seen, evidence which she says prima facie shows that the Russian state was responsible. Why has she arrived at that conclusion and not Jeremy Corbyn?
Emily Thornberry said quite clearly, prima facie, that she believed that the Russian authorities were to blame categorically for this. Jeremy is saying exactly the same. He's saying that the Russian authorities, whether it be the loss of control of the nerve agent or whether it be directly from the Kremlin, Jeremy has said that he believes that to be the case. It could be 1, it could be 2, but what we need is that evidence, that critical evidence, to ensure that we're correct. And when we get that evidence, we can act proportionately and decisive in what response we have to the Russian authorities on this unacceptable, barbaric incident which happened in Salisbury.
I mean, I think the question that many people are asking, and have been asking all week, is what level of evidence would it take to convince Jeremy Corbyn that this was an assault on the United Kingdom by the Russian state? I mean, in a sense, isn't he asking us to give the benefit of the doubt to Russia in the absence of further work by the security services, you know, work which has already been done, Porton Down and all the rest of it, and many, many people, including those who haven't had sight of the same intelligence your leader has, have arrived at the conclusion that the likeliest outcome in all of this is that the Russians were responsible and that Vladimir Putin knew all about it.
This is a very serious issue. This is a problem on the streets of the UK where UK residents have been poisoned on the streets by a nerve agent, which would be totally unacceptable in a wartime situation, never mind in a town like Salisbury. And we want to make sure that we've got all the evidence. It's not a case of likely, perhaps, or maybe. We want to have conclusive evidence that this nerve agent was supplied and used by the Russian authorities, either what Theresa May said, alternative 1 or alternative 2. We need to be exact in this, because if we don't get this right, this sort of thing could escalate, and it could, cut across the paths of many of our European counterparts. It could spread across the globe. We've got to get this right. And is it not right that we have the full evidence, not just partial evidence?
Again, I'm trying to work out exactly what level of evidence would lead you to believe that Vladimir Putin had a hand in this. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it generally is a duck. And actually, in essence, isn't Labour's position at the moment is we're supposed to be giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who lied about interfering in the US election, who lied about hosting the biggest programme of state-sponsored doping since East Germany, who's shown to have brought down that Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, lied through his teeth about Russian troops being active in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. We're to give the benefit of the doubt to that rather than the benefit of the doubt to the British Prime Minister.
We're not giving the benefit of the doubt to Russia, and in many ways we're supporting the statement made by Theresa May earlier this week. What we are saying is that we need conclusive evidence to ensure that going forward we're fully aware of where this nerve agent actually came from. Who the perpetrators were also is of great importance. We're not, by the way, this is not about looking like a duck, sounding like a duck, walking like a duck. This is a serious international incident, and we are absolutely certain that we cannot allow things to transpire in the future, whether it be days, weeks or months, without having the full knowledge of what actually has happened here.
Do you not accept,
that isn't rocket science, and I think people would accept that.
Indeed, many of them will. But at the same time, isn't it the case that actually, in giving at very least the impression of being equivocal about Russian responsibility for this, you have given the room for people like the Russian ambassador to the European Union to get in front of the cameras and suggest that we were responsible, that we manufactured it in Porton Down, and that we somehow delivered it to two people who carried a British passport?
You can blame Jeremy Corbyn for a lot of things, but certainly you shouldn't apportion the blame for the media circus to get those type of people in front of the TV camera on, at peak time to sit and suggest that it was other people other than the Russian authorities. Let me be clear. We firmly believe overwhelmingly that it's likely to be the Russian authorities who have conducted this heinous crime on UK soil. It is not acceptable. We've got to find out who the perpetrators were. We've got to be confident that we're right in what's being said, where the nerve agent actually came from, and ensure the safety of the people in this country, the people in the UK, and ensure that it doesn't, as I mentioned before, really cut across in other nations and become something more common, which would be a disaster.
Okay, just to be absolutely clear, because we are about to run out of time, what evidence would it take to convince the Labour Party that Vladimir Putin was responsible? This is not an episode of Hercule Poirot. You're not going to get someone standing over a bloody corpse with a knife in their hand and a confession letter in the other.
Well, we would want conclusive evidence of where the nerve agent actually came from. We want to know also who the perpetrators were, and then we would be convinced then, we would have the information then to make decisive and proportionate proposals on what actions the UK would take in relation to this diplomatic incident.
The point that seems to be made in support of Jeremy Corbyn so often on occasions like this is that, as one advisor says, he's some kind of foreign policy Cassandra. He always calls it right, but that we ignore him. But you look at his record, and hasn't he changed his mind as much as anyone else? I mean, membership of NATO, he used to be opposed to it, he now isn't. He used to be in favour of unilateral disarmament. I'm fairly certain that's no longer the case.
Jeremy's got a great history in campaigning on international issues, probably better than most people will ever have in the Commons. He's been in the Commons as an MP for 37 years, been part of many campaigns, a lot of the international issues, and he's been generally on the right side, and I've got lots and lots of respect for Jeremy's view on lots of these international incidents.
Mr. Lavery, we are literally out of time. I just want to say thank you very much for being with us on Sunday with Neil Paterson.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it.